Thank you, Mega. If you see the title of this program, there are four very important words and two relatively important words: advertisement, promotion, legal, and ethical. To me, are very important words. And other two words which are very important needs to be understood are medical devices and pharmaceutical products. Uh, Whenever we talk of promotion and advertisements, we always think of something being promoted, something being advertised, be it in print media, be it in electronic media. We have been seeing advertisements during web series, during movies, during serials, and even in some programs. Same way, you see a lot of advertisements in print media, your full page, half page ads. Why this is happening? Because it is said that advertisement and advertising and promotion are the key part which are integral to the business development of a company. End of the day, company has products that need to be served, that need to be consumed. But depending upon the product, they need to advertise. And when you talk of advertisement and marketing, I think advertisement and promotion, the word that comes to mind is marketing. Marketing is very important and key element. And when you talk of marketing, only one name that comes to my mind is Mr. Philip Kotler. He gave years ago marketing mix or marketing metrics of four P's: price, place, promotion, and other things. So what you see is the most important part here is promotion. But in 2013, he added fifth P, which was very relevant, very important point, which I think when he added, he was 83 years old. And that P was purpose. So he added purpose to his four P's, of which promotion was most important. And he mentioned while adding this that purpose is the core form of any business. And that is where I think ethics and legal part would come. And when you talk of marketing, I must share with you my two of my most favorite books, which I have read and again, and possibly digested an episode. One is a book by Michael Tracy titled Discipline of Market Leaders. And that is, I think, the most important book at NDA, that is Nishith Desai Associates, and highly recommended by Nishith Bhai, and Nishith Bhai must have read it million times, and he has been using and quoting that book. This is the book. I think this book talks very interesting points that uh, choose your customers, narrow your focus, and dominate the market. So that is where I think to focus on all these 3 points, that you are choosing, you are dominating, promotion is going to play a role. And to add to that, another favorite book of mine by Chan King called Blue Ocean Strategy. And the message that book gave was very simple, 300 odd pages book, but the message was don't compete with rivals, make them irrelevant. And that is where, whether you want to choose your customers and dominate the market, and without competing, just making your rivals irrelevant, that is the promotion and advertisement comes into picture. But let me go back to the fifth P by Philip Kotler, purpose. There is a lot of relevance because you see advertisements of books, you see advertisements of movies, you see promos of movies, promos of web series, promos of various events. But when it comes to something that deals with the life of patient, whether it is diagnosing some disease or it is used by doctors or hospitals in treating patient, then the purpose part comes very high and very relevant. And that is why a lot of people must be thinking why there is no regulations on promoting certain things. Of course, there are certain things on alcohol and beverages, but when it comes to pharmaceutical products and medical device, India does have laws, especially from advertisement. We have a law called DMRA, which is Drugs and Magic Remedies and Objectionable Advertisement Act. And on promotion side, we have UCPMP, which is Uniform Code for Pharmaceutical Marketing Practice. So these, of course, this code is voluntary to discuss that. But apart from that, there is one very important element to entire point of promotion of product, pharma and medical devices is what doctors who are going to do this. End user is possibly a doctor as well as a patient, depending upon the business model company is adopting. So there are certain regulations even for doctors on promotion of products, what they can do, what they cannot do, and that is where the Medical Council of India Code of Ethics comes into picture, which has laid down a few points on professional etiquette and business conduct. In fact, recently released telemedicine guidelines on 25th of March was also added to the Code of Ethics by Medical Council of India just 5 days ago. And now, though Medical Council of India is dismantled and there is a National Medical Commission, the Code of Ethics still rules, etc., are formed, are yet to come. But why regulations? Why so many sets of regulations? Not every country would have so many regulations. Some countries do have, with a lot of caveats and a lot of exemption. But what I understand is the objective is two or threefold, because the products are going to be used for the treatment of a disease in a patient, or a medical device which is going to be used to treat something or diagnose something, there is a possibility of overuse, misuse, or abuse. Depending upon how patient takes it, depending upon how doctor prescribes it, is going to decide whether it is overused, misused, or abused. I don't see a lot of possibilities of overuse here, but it will be more of a misuse and abuse, leading to self-medications and complications that can happen. And that is why we thought, why not discuss this very interesting point. And when the companies need to add that fifth P purpose to the four Ps, they need to think of self-regulations because certain codes are voluntary. Doctors need to adopt certain laws which are binding, and there are also additional tax issues. So we thought of having a discussion on these particular points, what exactly the situation is, what can be done, what should not be done. So let us start, I think, with advertisement part. So Darren, I'll start with you. What are the rules that regulate direct to consumer advertisements of drugs and medical devices in India? I know there could be some difference between drug and medical device, but if you can give a general overview, should be fine. When you need to distinguish between drug and medical device, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Antani. I think you've summarized the entire thing pretty. The Bible of drug promotional law in the country, especially when it comes to advertisement to or direct to consumer, and that Drugs and Magic Remedies, Objectionable Advertisements Act of 1954, as well as the rules that have been framed under it, which happened in 1955. So the primary purpose behind why this legislation was brought into effect can be seen in relation to how the courts have interpreted these provisions. And the fundamental is that you make sure that none of your advertisements are in a manner that can lead the public to self-medicate. That needs provision within this particular legislation needs to be looked at. So this is something that has been debated not only from our end but also by the courts. One thing to keep in mind is that the definition of a drug is not the same as the definition provided by the existing drug regulatory framework, which is the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. The to interpret that it's not just drugs and pharmaceutical products, but even medical devices, whether regulated or unregulated, get covered within the ambit of this particular legislation. So when we talk about the restrictions that apply under the DMRA, we have to remember that these restrictions apply equally to both pharmaceutical products as well as for medical device products as well. So what are these restrictions? So there are a couple of general prohibitions that the DMRA puts out, and this is in relation to not putting out any sort of misleading advertisement, not making advertisements in relation to prevention of miscarriage, or for treatment or improvement in terms of sexual pleasure. But all of these have to be looked in along with the broader restriction, which comes under the schedule to the DMRA. Now, the schedule to the DMRA contains a list of diseases and conditions for which no drug can be used for advertisement, for it to be used as an advertisement to treat, mitigate, cure, prevent in any form, basically, saying that, and basically that schedule is a strict no-no. Now, that schedule was last amended many years ago, and the government is looking at trying to make some sort of amendments to that schedule. We don't know when that might come out, but the draft for that particular amendment has also been put in the public domain, and we have also submitted our comments to the schedule. Now, in the DMRA, you also have to remember that there are specific exemptions that have been prescribed. But these exemptions are more in tune with confidential advertisement of drugs to healthcare practitioners, as well as for scientific material that has been put out in any sort of educational books and treatises. Now, that more or less covers what we see under the DMRA. At the same time, even under the drug regulatory framework, there are a couple of restrictions that need to be kept in mind. One is under the Drugs and Cosmetics Rules of 1945. There is a Schedule J under this Drugs and Cosmetics Rules, which also contains a list of similar diseases and conditions as we see under the schedule to the DMRA as well. Now, the DMC rules basically say that you can't have any advertisement which tries to promote curing or, again, the same mitigation, treatment, or anything of that particular schedule. But what is interesting is that provision that talks about the prohibition is within the chapter of the rules that deal with labeling. So an argument can be made that that entire Schedule J may only apply to the actual label of the product and not otherwise. Now, apart from the Schedule J restrictions, there are also provisions within the cosmetics rules which have a blanket prohibition stating that there can be no advertisement relating to Schedule H, H1, and X drugs. So these schedules deal with prescription products and they deal with narcotic and psychotropic substances. So there is a strict no-no, and it applies across the board, not just with manufacturers or importers, not just with the label, but across the board to any person. Now, apart from this, there are a couple of industry standards and industry codes, like Dr. Antani mentioned. There is the UCPMP, and within the UCPMP, that deals largely with how the advertisements can take place with respect to healthcare practitioners. But there is no such code today that Indian companies follow when it comes to direct to consumer advertisements itself. So I think with that, back to you, Dr. Antani.
Yeah, I think very rightly put that we have Drugs and Cosmetic Act and rules, you have UCPMP code, you have Drugs and Magic Remedies and Objectionable Advertisement Act also. And we have codes, as you mentioned, like OPPI, which is Organization of Pharmaceutical Producers of India, also has a code which the members have to follow. Now, before I move on to other important point, I have an additional question to this. Now, is there any provision that a particular act would override other act, or they work independently in a situation?
That's a very good question, Doc. And in fact, we've had to analyze this on multiple occasions. We have to remember that every legislation works in conjunction with the other. No legislation with respect to promotional or marketing activities can override the other. So then, when a company looks at how they need to structure their promotional and marketing activities, they need to keep in mind all restrictions in its entirety and not just individual.
Okay, understood. That's very nicely explained. Very important to know for everybody, whether it is any in the audience or listening to us. Now, Shreya, Darren gave us a very interesting download of all the regulations, what can be done, what should not be done, and which are the acts and rules that regulate. Now, I want you to tell us all that are all direct to consumer advertisements are prohibited? Maybe no. And Darren also mentioned about various implications of non-compliance. So courts, how courts are taking this, or rather I can say how courts are interpreting this type of advertisements when it comes to pharma and medical device products promotion and advertisement, sorry, from this law's point of view. And if you can share one or two important relevant case laws, that would be great.
Thank you so much for that question, Dr. Antani. It's actually a really interesting question because, like everything in the law, it aims to regulate certain things, but then there's always space for legitimate advertisement or for people to be able to communicate or promote their drugs in some other ways. So I think Darren has already highlighted two really important aspects. One, that the DMRA does permit advertising to healthcare practitioners in a confidential manner, which we will come to later on, maybe in further questions. But on direct-to-consumer advertisements, like he said, the main purpose of the DMRA is to ensure that advertisements of relating to certain disorders are not made. So to be very specific, under the DMRA, Section 3 of the DMRA particularly, it prohibits making advertisements that make claims to a procurement of miscarriage in women. Second, ones that purport to prevent misconception in women. Third, which purport correct menstrual disorders. So these are the three main first. And then in the last portion, it refers to a schedule to the DMRA, which has a list of about 58 disorders ranging from cancer, diabetes, heart disease, fever, tuberculosis. And the Act says that no advertisement can claim to prevent, diagnose, cure, or mitigate any of these disorders. So, which is why when you look at direct-to-consumer advertisements, we have to look at it in two ways. One, is the disorder that you are aiming to cure, diagnose, etc., mentioned in that list of disorders? Odds are it usually will, because it's a fairly exhaustive list. In those cases, you cannot advertise the drug in a manner that suggests that that drug can be used to cure or treat these disorders. But in the event that the disorder is not in the list, so for instance, ear infections are not in the list, acne is not in the list. So in those cases, you can make advertisements that maybe claim to cure an ear infection or claim to prevent acne, and so those types of claims are permitted. But more interestingly, this is the second bit. Even if the disorder is mentioned in the schedule, for instance, cancer is mentioned in the schedule, it is still permissible for someone to merely advertise a medical device, but in terms that it does not say that it's going to prevent or cure cancer. So you can just talk about how this machine exists. And if you're able to do it in a really clever way without referring to any disorder, then that's something that is permissible. Secondly, you can always run awareness programs on things like on the disorders that are mentioned. So you can have awareness programs for cancer or diabetes, talk about what the symptoms are, and maybe just end those with, if you have any of these symptoms, go see your doctor, and not mention any drug at the end of those advertisements. That's how we typically see it done in India right now. So that's the broad aspect of it. The problem, one of the issues with the schedule is that obviously the schedule in some areas is very vague. So for instance, it just has nerve disorders. Like, what does that mean? It has disorders relating to women, which is a very, very vague entry to have been, which is just catch-all. So obviously those things are things that need to be fixed. And like Dan mentioned, there is an amendment in the works, and the amendment fixes it to a certain extent and provides clarity on maybe some disorders, but a lot of vague disorders are still there. On your second question on how courts seem to have interpreted this, they've interpreted it really interestingly. So the first case where this came up before the courts was this case in the 1950s called Hamdard Dawakhana, which was a constitutional challenge to the validity of the act itself, where they said, the DMRA is not valid. It's like a freedom. It's infringing the freedom of trade. The court held no, that's not the case. It's a very understandable restriction on that freedom. But what's very important is that they went a step beyond, and they said that the purpose of this act is to prevent magical remedies from being to prevent magical and obscene remedies from being advertised to the public, and secondly, and very most importantly, to prevent self-medication. And these few paragraphs in Hamdard Dawakhana have been the base on which future court decisions have forwarded. So, for instance, there's another case called Amit Singh versus State, in which the in which this hospital called Center for Sight Hospital had advertised a micro lens to cure cataract. Now, cataract is mentioned in the schedule to the DMRA. So technically, you can't advertise something that says it can cure cataract. But the Delhi High Court said that, Amit, like the Center for Sight Hospital had not violated the DMRA because the intention of the act was to prevent self-medication. And a micro lens to cure cataract, it's not a lens that you can just go buy from a chemist and use. It's a surgical operation that can only be performed by a surgeon. So you'd have to go approach a hospital to avail of those procedures. So to that extent, because it can't encourage self-medication, the Delhi High Court said, you know what, Center for Sight Hospital is perfectly within the law. And this position has been framed and has been upheld again very recently in 2018 by the Karnataka High Court in another case called Lundbeck versus State of Karnataka, which related to a newspaper advertisement of a certain medical device. Now, as we go forward, there are, with the times, there are new challenges that come about. And one of these challenges happens to be uploading or engaging in the sale of medication, drugs, and medical devices online on e-commerce platforms. And the implications that come with that, especially because, as some of you may know, from April 1, 2020, the CDSCO has begun the process of regulating all devices as medical devices. So maybe the sale of even basic things like clinical thermometers or glucose monitoring systems, which are going to come within the ambit of MDR from January of next year, is something that has become particularly sensitive. And so these are issues that will have to be looked into as we go forward. Over to you, Dr. Antani.
I think, thank you, Shreya, and you touched upon two or three very important points. And first is, I think, DMRA and the schedule. The schedule you mentioned and use the word disorder, which is a lawyer will understand, but it will be very difficult for a doctor to understand that. And I remember when I became a lawyer 14 years ago and came across this schedule in DMRA, and I was scratching my head whether these are diseases, whether these are ailments, whether these are just conditions, symptoms, or signs, because it's a mixture of all. And honestly speaking, it has become a kind of a confusing, catching all type of provision, bearing few exceptions, which Shreya mentioned while she was talking. So I think, and Darren very rightly mentioned that there is a proposal to amend, but unfortunately, schedule has not taken into consideration with a lot of depth into it. But I think the time has come to relook at the schedule, and I'm sure, and we have given comments on the bill which was proposed for public comment, and we have emphasized that the schedule needs to be relooked properly. Not that we do not, we need some kind of a control over advertisements and promotion of devices as well as pharma products, but we need to be, there has to be some rational, and it was a very old act. Now we are in 2020 and things have changed. That is number one. Another important point, Shreya, you just mentioned about thermometers and other products, and we are seeing so many products online where you go to Amazon, you go to Flipkart, or you go to company's website, or you go to even India Mart. There are so many portals where you can get certain drugs and certain medical devices. We'll go into regulatory and unregulatory a little bit later. But I think there is a online business coming up. Government also is coming out with e-pharmacy regulations that may include later on these also. But I think when it becomes e-commerce and everybody is talking about e-commerce, one point that definitely comes into my mind, especially when you have, online sale or a sale of medical products, pharma products on a online platform or a digital platform. I see something because India on medical device sector is a significantly big imported products market, foreign driven products. You will see a lot of companies, and we have been advising a lot of companies on how exactly the websites can be managed, how exactly products can be promoted, etc. So Ashish, you are tech champion when it comes to medical device and pharma. So I just wanted to tell us purely from tax perspective, are there any points which should be taken into consideration while marketing products in India in general? That is number one. And of course, as I talked upon on promoting or selling on digital platform online, whether there could be any issues with cross-border transaction or within India itself.
Sure. Thanks, Doc. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, very well.
Thank you. So I think two separate points there. First, on online selling of pharmaceutical goods, and then also on marketing. I'll first go on the first point of online sale, which is now becoming prevalent, versus marketing on the second point. On online sale of goods, I think two important points that need to be considered. And these are just recent changes made to the Income Tax Act by the Finance Act of 2020. First is that of right, exactly. So first is that of equalization levy. Now, what is equalization levy? Equalization levy was earlier introduced in 2016 for a very particular kind of service that was made available by non-residents with respect to advertisement. But this has now been expanded to include any e-commerce operator who is providing goods or online services through an e-commerce platform. Now, unfortunately, while equalization levy was intended to target the Amazons and the Flipkarts of the world, the way the definition has been provided for and what it all includes, it includes everything from a pin to a plane, and therefore even pharmaceutical products being sold online have the risk of being considered to be equalization levy. So basically, if a non-resident is selling products to an Indian resident through online mode, there is an equalization levy that is applicable. The current rate is 2% or 2% of the value, and therefore that is something that needs to be considered and kept in mind. The
Quickly explain what equalization levy is for the audience in very brief.
sure. So equalization levy, like I said, was introduced in 2016, and this is basically one of the proposals of the Organization of Economic, the OECD, simply put, where in order to stop base erosion, they had said that there should be a level playing field for both residents and non-residents, and therefore this concept of equalization levy was had come up with, where they wanted to target the Amazon and Flipkarts of the world and say that, because you have these various incentives available to you, the Indian player should also be given enough room to play on the same market with you. However, as the provisions read today, even a healthcare organization, which is perhaps maybe a not-for-profit also, could be included in this, and equalization levy could hit that organization. The second point on this aspect that also I'd like to make clear is with respect to withholding obligation on e-commerce operators that has been introduced again by this budget. Here, what the law effectively says is that if you are an e-commerce operator and you are providing provision of services or online sale of goods, then you are going to be withholding tax of 1% before making a payment to the seller of the product. So if I was the buyer, I would be paying, say, about $1,000 for a particular pharmaceutical product, and then the e-commerce operator, the one who's running the platform on which the product is sold, has the liability to withhold 1% tax and pay to the tax department. Now, this causes a lot of issue from a non-resident perspective because one, that they have the liability to withhold taxes, and second, from a payment settlement perspective, technically these monies from the buyers never actually reach the accounts of the e-commerce operators. It is directly paid to the seller who's selling it on the platform. Therefore, this is an unfortunate burden on the e-commerce operator. But a couple of things that should be kept in mind. With respect to marketing, I think the important point to consider is that while marketing activities are generally fine and you can go ahead and market your product in India, from a perspective of going beyond marketing, right? When you start even entering into contracts with the customers or negotiating with the customers, there is where there is a risk of business connection or a permanent establishment that the foreign entity may have in India. Uh, but proper checks and balances in the document is something that you can keep in mind and restrict the activities to only marketing for the non-resident to not have a permanent establishment in India. Very quickly, a permanent establishment is basically when when a business enterprise has a permanent fixed place of business in India. That's when you generally form a permanent establishment. There are various types of permanent establishment, but we can get into that later. Effective point being that if you are carrying out, if the person in India is selling goods on your behalf, including concluding contracts on your behalf, then there is a risk of permanent establishment that you need to consider and work out. That's about it.
Thank you, Ashish. And I think I'm happy that these are manageable things and not frightening things. What is required, I think, is a compliance and being aware of these provisions. But I think you mentioned about Amazons and Flipkarts and e-commerce players, and you said it's a very wide and broad definition. So if there is a medical device company based out of Europe, Singapore, or US, or any foreign jurisdiction, they have their own website or a portal and they sell their products or promote their products for consumers in India. The same thing would be applicable to that company as well. That's my understanding, right?
That's right, absolutely, Doc. That would be applicable.
That's a very important point because what we are seeing is the trend of a lot of companies having their own website and portal and they want to promote directly. However, as Shreya mentioned, that all the devices are being regulated. However, there is a window of exemptions of 30 months and 42 months. But that is going to be a very important point. I think people need to be aware of. Thank you very much for that great insight on tax part. Now, Darren, we talked about advertisements, and there is, as I said, that unless products are prescribed by doctors and consumed by the patient, because patient knows doctors and patient consumes what doctor tells, unless there are certain things that happen at a pharmacy level called substitution, which are where there are strict laws in India. At the same time, devices which are unless purchased and used by labs or doctors for either treatment or diagnosis, it's not going to work. It doesn't make a strong business model. Even if hospital per se as an entity is buying those products, ultimately doctors are going to use them. The devices are prescribed products. So I just want you to tell us about promotion of these products, whether device or drug, to healthcare practitioners, which are doctors, which I was for 14 years till 2004. What are the general regulations? Mainly to doctors. Let us talk only that.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Antani. So I think I'll divide this between marketing activities and promotional activities, because largely marketing activities would deal with trying to provide information to the doctors with respect to an actual product, whereby promotional activities could also include a broader ambit, which is, organizing conferences, organizing seminars, CME programs, so on and so forth. And there are restrictions for both. So on the marketing side, we have to go back to the DMRA, like you mentioned, Dr. Antani, whereby confidential advertisement is permitted through HCPs, and the rules DMRA give a little more insight as to what needs to be done. They basically say that you need to mark every advertisement that is aided to a HCP as confidential. One thing to keep in mind is that the way in which registered medical practitioner has been defined, it only covers practitioners in the allopathic stream. It does not include currently Ayurvedic or homeopathic doctors. So technically, that exemption should apply only with respect to allopathy. Now, this is pretty much the guidance we received from the DMRA. But if a company had to look into how they could use best practices, that's where the UCPMP comes into play. The UCPMP has guidelines in terms of marketing material on both what should be done and what should not be done. On what should not be done, one, it says that you should not market any drug for which the marketing approval has not been received yet. Another one is with respect to using of certain words. For example, the use of the word safe. It should only be used when that claim can be substantiated. And also when you use the word new, it can only be used if a drug has been released in the past 12 months only. Now, on what should be done, there are particular requirements that the UCPMP puts out with respect to promotional material. First of all, it should only be given to those doctors who are capable of prescribing the drug that you're talking about. And apart from that, it should also contain material or declarations such as when it was last revised, how the HCP can obtain additional information, so on and so forth. Now, as we're also talked about, the UCPMP is still voluntary in nature. So these are guidelines that are prescribed, which can be adopted by the industry as a best practice. On the promotional side, this is where things get a little more restricted for the HCPs, because the Indian Medical Council's Code of Ethics, that's where a lot of the interaction between HCPs and the pharma companies are prescribed. So what it tries to do, and the fundamental that is trying to be addressed within this code, is to ensure that none of the purchasing decisions or none of the prescribing decisions made by a particular HCP is influenced by any promotional activity that is carried out by a pharmaceutical or a medical device company. So in that vein, what the MCI code basically says is that you cannot provide any sort of hospitality or travel arrangements for HCPs to attend any kind of webinar, any kind of seminar, CME program, or the like, when the attendance is required as a delegate. Apart from this, it also pass on any cash or monetary grant to any HCP under any pretext. So these are broadly some of the restrictions that you find under the MCI code. But at the same time, there is one provision that says that professional engagement of HCPs are permitted. So so long as you use your professional autonomy and such an engagement is disclosed. Now, when it comes to the UCPMP, the converse restrictions that are applicable under the MCI code is placed on the pharmaceutical and medical device companies. But as we have discussed, the UCPMP is not binding as such on the companies. We have seen that the government was at one point trying to make the UCPMP mandatory by issuing a draft legislation. However, at this stage, we understand that that draft legislation has been taken back, but we do hear that there will at some point be some legislation that is to be made mandatory from the side of the medical device companies. So as of right now, the UCPMP is being administered and enforced by industry associations, and the penalties that you're looking at in terms of non-compliance is largely limited to reprimands that can be issued by the industry associations, and also publication of that reprimand on the website of the industry associations. But the softer point that companies need to be reminded of is the fact that a UCPMP violation can still lead to reputational loss or reputational risk to the company. So we see that most ethical companies and most foreign multinational companies do follow the UCPMP in some form or the other, or in fact, they do follow other or more restricted codes that we've seen, such as the IFPMA code or other international codes which are applicable to member companies as well. So with that, over to you, Dr. Antani.
Yeah, I think very rightly put, and I just also want to add a few points here that yes, UCPMP is one of the very important document that has been voluntary for a pretty long time, and there is a proposal to make that UCPMP, which is a voluntary code today, to into a law, and some movements have already happened before. Unfortunately, the COVID crisis started, and there is a provision to come out with a law under Essential Commodities Act, which was amended for the first time after so many years, considering a COVID crisis. So once that comes, that's going to be more binding across the industry and may pose some concerns to be complying with all the provisions. Because today UCPMP also has one very interesting provision, is that anything which is not covered in UCPMP, the Medical Council of India's Code of Ethics provisions would be applicable. So it's a kind of a blanket document which covers almost everything. There was also a proposal for similar code for medical device sector called UCMDMP, but it is still in pipeline, work in process. But there is a specific notification that UCPMP code would be applicable even to medical device manufacturers and products. So there is one, as Darren very rightly mentioned, seen many companies, especially MNCs, being aware of that, and many of our clients believe that we want to abide by UCPMP as if it is a law. And so far today, most of the companies abide by UCPMP as a self-regulation, and they have a very robust and strong ethical policy on promotion to HCPs, that is doctors. So I think on companies side, even though there are no major regulations prohibiting them to do certain things. They are abiding. That's a great part. Now coming back to doctors, you touched upon all the most of the important provisions where doctor can enter into a advisory arrangement or a professional services arrangement. But I also want to understand two things. Doctors are often invited as speakers, whether it's a train the trainer or a speaker at a CME for possibly the group of professionals at the company or other doctors on training without mentioning their products or with mentioning their product. Can you quickly throw some light for a minute or so on this part, train the trainer and speaking engagement for doctors?
Sure, sure. Thanks, Dr. Antani. You're right. There are multiple different professional engagements that we see when a does interact with different pharma and medical device companies. Now, the MCI code, which is currently binding on the medical practitioners, it does permit that side of things. So long as you maintain that professional autonomy, so long as you maintain that disclosure with respect to that engagement, then those cases, it should not be a problem to be engaged by the pharmaceutical and medical device companies for these activities. So we do see that there are different kinds of engagements that we find. Like you said, there's train the trainer, whereby a HCP will go ahead and train multiple other HCPs, who in turn may go ahead and train other HCPs, and so on and so forth. We also see scientific advisory board agreements, where the doctors will be part of a panel discussion or an advisory board, which will give feedback in terms of how a particular product has been used in the market. We see invitations for doctors to come in as a speaker for particular events, and in most situations, keeping in mind the other requirements from the UCPMP perspective, we see that companies usually build in requirements such as not specifically promoting their own product as a part of that professional engagement, so that the independence of the HCP can be communicated while being engaged for these kind of events. So all of this is not an issue from an MCI code perspective, and is permitted under the MCI code.
Great. Thank you, Darren, for that additional information. So, Ashish, you touched upon very important and very pertinent tax issues on marketing, promotion, and advertisements of pharma products, and that's prompted me to ask further question. And I'm reminded of one circular, if I remember right, it was in 2012 or 13, which was a circular by CBDT, and it was pertaining to the expenses incurred by the company on product promotions to doctors or various organizations. So I want you to first of all talk about the circular and what are the tax implications on expenses because of this particular circular, whether they can be exempted under business income category. That is number one. And from this point of view, what is your advice to companies? And if possible, what would be the advice for doctors? Why I'm asking you additional question on doctors is many times doctors do purchase directly either the equipments, devices, or a big quantity of drug. Would there could be some kind of a tax issue from them because it could be simple independent doctor, or it could be LLP of doctors, or it could be just a company. If you can quickly touch upon all these 3 points. Sorry to jumble up questions into one bouquet.
Not a problem, Doc. Sure. So I think I'll just take a 1 minute step back on explaining why the circular was issued and what does it tend to cover. Now, under the Income Tax Act, when you are carrying out a business, the expenses which are laid out or expended wholly or exclusively for this business are eligible to be deducted from your total income to arrive at your profit on which you are going to pay tax. Now the provision which covers this also provides that expenses which have been incurred, which are either an offense or prohibited by law, shall be denied as expenses, and you will not get the benefit of deduction, and therefore you're going to pay a higher tax if that is the case. Now, what was happening, what the CBDT saw was that expenses by companies were being carried out where they were providing freebies to doctors, medical practitioners, and considering it to be expenses from their total income, and therefore reducing their total tax profits, and thereby reducing total taxes. Now that is when the CBDT came out and said that this is the provision 37(1) of but there are also these provisions of the Indian Medical Council Professional Conduct Etiquette and Ethics Regulation, which say under which expenses where you are providing freebies will automatically be considered to be denied, because under that regulation you are not allowed to provide such kind of freebies. Right now, this was basically where all of this took place, and how deduction is not allowed when you are providing freebies. But this was actually challenged, and when it was challenged, it was upheld. However, they put a rider on that on the where they simply said that if the taxpayer is satisfying that to the assessing officer that the expenditure is not in violation of the MCI regulations, then it can legitimately claim the deduction. So the onus was therefore put wholly on the assessee to satisfy whether the circular was applicable or not applicable in his or her own case. Uh, that was an interesting development, and how the CBDT relied upon the MCI regulations to come up with this circular. And from then on, there have been multiple cases which have actually looked into this circular and said whether it is whether reduction will be allowed or not. Now, one particular aspect that becomes very relevant over here is that the MCI regulations are for the medical practitioners, the doctors, right? And does not really apply to pharmaceutical companies. Therefore, the question that came up was, can the CBDT circular therefore restrict a pharmaceutical company to take the deduction? At that point in time, the cases and which have evolved now 7-8 years after the circular came out, that doing something like this is actually is opposed to public policy, where you are giving out freebies to doctors, and therefore whether the circular or not covers the pharmaceutical companies, the fact that it is opposed to public policy is good enough ground for it to be disallowed for income tax purposes. And that's where it becomes really relevant. That just because you have a circular which may not be really covering you, but there is public policy on the other hand which you need to consider before doing such a thing. We had seen situations where doctors were given passes to attend conferences which were outside India, and these expenses were taken as deduction. So the question was whether this was actually expended only for the purpose of the business, and perhaps it was not, and that is where it came into play.
Okay. Thank you, Ashish. And
Sure, Doctor. Thanks.
say something.
No, thank you.
Please go. Yeah. So I think very very nicely articulated why this particular situation happened and why this particular circular got evolved, and everybody needs to be aware of that. So I think broadly we have covered. So Shreya, I want you to tell us. We have a few questions also we'll touch upon. Uh, can you just tell us now? Let's go to best practices or ideal practices or the good practices. It is said that certain things must be done, should be done, nice to do. It's okay if you do, and hell with it. You know. But I just want to tell us about what what type of certain things or certain advice you would like to give it to pharmaceutical on promotion and advertisement. That these are the things you should keep in mind while promoting. It could be maybe a gist of what we have discussed so far. Yeah, Shreya. For companies, not to doctors.
Of course. Um, Thank you, Dr. Antani. So I'll just start with the must do. And the must do is that every piece of literature that you send to a doctor or an HCP has to be as per the rules for maintaining confidentiality that are prescribed in the drugs magic remedies rules. And that is really simple compliance also. Essentially, the material needs to be given in a sealed envelope addressed directly to the doctor or to their practice, and on both the envelope and on the top of the literature you have to say that this is for the purpose of for the consumption or for the reference of a laboratory, medical practitioner or hospital only. Now, a lot of these days, literature material goes over emails because no one really sends things by post anymore. So in those cases, both the body of the email and the literature that is sent over the email, which is the attachment, should also specify that this is for the reference of doctors and hospitals and not for the consumption or for reference by consumers. The next thing to keep in mind is that every interaction that happens with any healthcare practitioner, and this is doubly important for healthcare practitioners that may be government healthcare practitioners, where they consult with government hospitals or they're employed by government hospitals or universities, that every activity and every engagement with the HCP is documented. This is because a lot of the practices that are considered to be unethical, and this serves as proof or safeguards against someone later on accusing that the pharmaceutical company's practices are unethical. So every time you're entering into a contract with the doctor for train the trainer programs or going into or for speaking at conferences, so on and so forth, these things should be put down in an advisory agreement or a consultancy agreement so that there's proper record of it that's maintained. The next thing to remember is to keep in mind the guidelines that the UCPMP says for literature. And again, they're like fairly simple guidelines on when the word new and safe should be used, like Dan spoke about, how all claims should always be capable of substantiation, how they should always be updated, and how the claims should be dated so that when the HCP is referring and they see that the drug is capable of doing this, they can see the date on which this was done. And more importantly, you should always market drugs that is consistent with the terms of its approval. So it would not be preferable to market the off-label indications of drugs. So if you haven't received approval for that specific indication, don't market the drug for that indication. And the last thing to keep in mind is that, and this is the most important thing that we see companies miss out on, right? Which is that when they have websites that talk about their products, they have the same website for HCPs and for patients. Or even if they have separate websites, it's very easy for the patients to just, click on something and say, I'm a healthcare practitioner and go on to the healthcare practitioner's website. Now, there is no jurisprudence currently on whether that is permitted or whether that's enough of a safeguard. But ideally, when a pharmaceutical company is promoting any drugs online, which are specifically aimed at doctors, they should ensure that there's a separate page for advertising those drugs, where the doctors have to put in maybe their MCI registration code that they receive at the time of registration, put their email address and such before they're given access to that website. So I think that's a very important to do that should be kept in mind. And lastly, that the pharmaceutical company should always be open to questions by doctors that are given on the basis of the literature. So literature should contain a little declaration that says, more information can be provided on request. So this is another good to do under the UCPMP. So this is the general things that pharma companies should keep in mind.
Thank you very much. That was very clear-cut points which I think companies need to be aware of. So Darren, before we move on to question answer session, Shreya talked about companies. Can you take us about things what HCPs or the doctors need to keep in mind very briefly, maybe 1 or 2 minutes?
Sure. So first, I think I'll touch upon a couple of questions that we keep getting questions about. One, the fact that the MCI code still applies, because a lot of doctors mention that because the NMC Act has come in and no rules have been notified yet, the MCI code may or may not be applicable today. But we need to remember that the MCI code, until any other rules have been prescribed under the NMC Act, we need to continue to comply with that requirement. The other common question we always get is it okay if I can take like a gift or a monetary benefit below the value of 1,000 rupees? Because under the cancellation starts at rupees. But if you look at the pure law, absolute restriction with respect to cash or monetary grants, apart from the professional engagements where you can receive remuneration. So it's not the case that merely because there is a threshold of 1,000 rupees, you can go ahead and accept any sort of cash or monetary benefits below that. You have to remember that it is an absolute prohibition. Another thing that some doctors also think is that the medical councils are not looking at some of these activities. We have seen many cases with respect to unethical conduct and promotion activities which are not in compliance with the MCI code being taken up at the MCI level. And we have seen many cases where there have been issues with respect to suspension or cancellation of registrations. So you need to be careful about how you engage with pharma companies as well as medical device companies. So on that premise, since professional engagements are permitted, there are still some things that you should keep in mind. First of all, go through the documentation properly. Is there anything in that agreement that could affect your professional autonomy? If that is the case, flag it out and have a conversation with the company so that you can accordingly, so that your professional autonomy is maintained. Because one of the very few requirements that give you that permission is to make sure that the autonomy is maintained. And where required, you should disclose the fact that you may be paid for a particular engagement. For example, if you are giving a talk, your slide deck may have to have a disclaimer saying that you are engaged by a particular company as well. Another thing that we find a lot of our clients facing difficulties with is that doctors are seldom comfortable with an agreement that's more than one page. But what doctors need to remember is that just because a contract is long, it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. In fact, it may be a very good thing that a contract is long because it has obligations and rights prescribed for both doctors as well as pharma companies. And it's not always the case that a one pager could cover everything adequately. So you should always remember that even if a contract is too long, it could actually be to your benefit as well. So with that, I think back to you, Dr. Antani.
Thank you, Darren. I think that's very important, and I think the doctor needs to change that mindset, or there is a time for paradigm shift. That yes, I need to sign on dotted lines sometimes on contracts. So please read contracts in any form and sign on that. So I think thank you, Darren, Shreya, Ashish, for wonderful discussion. I just asked for 5 minutes extension because there's some very interesting questions. So we'll quickly pick up a few questions. Some are already answered. One question is from Pritish P. And I must thank Pritish for being very active participant in all pharma healthcare related sessions and asking very interesting questions. He has a very interesting question. Of course, Shreya has already addressed it. But the question is, how will the direct to consumer marketing activities evolve in India? Is there a need? Can this be an alternative model? For example, Pfizer's example of Viagra for direct to consumer marketing. And then Shreya very rightly mentioned that you need to create that balance between need and wants and regulations. But yes, it will evolve. End of the day, in India, healthcare is a highly fragmented, and the consumers are from far place to very accessible place. And apart from affordability, if you compare to, well, affordability is not a major issue in India, purely from price of a drug from global point of view. But however, from India point of view, there is a need for, that is why we have a one particular price available and a product available at different price. But there is definitely a need for direct to consumer. The reason is it will reduce the price, it will create huge affordability. At the same time, it will provide easy access. However, there needs to be a proper balance, as Shreya rightly mentioned, on regulations and other things. Another question from Gaurav Tanna. He says he has just highlighted one case of Purdue and how HCB played a role. Thank you very much for bringing to us. There is one question from Kartik Vyas. We see and hear a lot that there is a regular violation to UCPMP. How do you see this trend changing and violators being published in the time come within the scope of current applicable regulation? First of all, I don't agree with the question. There cannot be violation of UCPMP because UCPMP is not law. UCPMP is still a voluntary code which authorities expect companies to comply. It is the company's call, depending upon their own company policy, whether to follow provisions which are based in their policy based on UCPMP. So saying that there are violators of UCPMP, I don't agree. However, there are practices. That is where I think the being ethical and being legal issue comes. That is where ethics come into picture. Whether I should do, whether though UCPMP is not a law, should I still follow it? I have seen most of our clients following UCPMP to the T, and I'm very happy about it. So I think to answer your question, they are not violation. There is a question on Gaurav Khatri's ventilator manufactured need to be under, I think I can't, under license. Interesting question. And there is another question also we started before we started the webinar on ventilator in present situation. Yes, ventilator would be regulated. The reason is that in our session on medical device, we did mention that there was a notification in February 2020 which asked all the company manufacturers to register their products with the authorities, and they also expanded the definition of medical device, which is covering everything. So any device that is used for diagnosis, treatment, mitigation would be a medical device. However, the provision was that if your product is into class A, or there's a division of class A, B, C, D, class A, B, less risk, and C and D, higher risk. There was an exemption given if your products are registered by 1st of April from applicability of drugs and cosmetic, applicability of medical device rules that are under Drugs and Cosmetic Act and rules. So if ventilators were manufactured before 1st of April would definitely be considered as a drug, but however, there would be an exemption from the requirements under Drugs and Cosmetic Act medical device rules. However, to answer the first question, a lot of companies started manufacturing products, ventilators and other things after 1st April, when there was a huge need because of COVID crisis. They would definitely come under regulations, and they were required to obtain approvals from CDACO, there is Central Drug Authority, and they have given permissions. However, certain issues were there on qualities. A lot of news are coming from Gujarat and other places. Daman 1 has some issues where doctors are not satisfactory. But to answer the question, yes, they are definitely uh, 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 regulations covering them. Now, I will ask this question to you, Darren, and I think you have handled this many times. The last question: can product promotion materials be sent or shown to various HCPs in same email or on a digital format or digital platform? Would you like to answer this?
So yeah, especially in this situation, a lot of companies have been asking us the same question, and the short answer is yes, you can, but there needs to be some new practices that the company should also adopt in order to ensure that the requirements of the DMRA and the UCPMP, whether or not you follow the UCPMP, are met. And what we try and advise a lot of our clients is to set up some sort of a portal whereby your doctors can only access it by way of credentials after verification of the medical council registration number, so on and so forth, in order to meet the requirement of having communicated that particular advertisement confidentially. So when we take the entire DMRA into an online perspective, yes, it is still possible to go ahead and advertise to doctors' confidentiality, but there definitely needs to be some adjustments in how that advertisement takes place.
Thank you, Darren. I think there is one question from Meera Manjari on DMRA and how schedule behaves and whether it is a magic remedy or promote self-medication. And I think we have answered that question, citing few case laws. I think thank you very much, everybody. But I would like to just end by 2 or 3 important points. One is on advertisements. Let us strike a balance, and that is why we thought of having a title being ethical and being legal, because there needs to be a balance of both. One, let us talk law. That is the DMRA. prohibits, as we discussed, on advertisements of certain things based on the schedule. And I specifically mentioned that there is an issue with the schedule, honestly speaking. It is very vague. However, there is a proposal to amend DMRA, but I personally feel a specific rule relook at the schedule which mentions diseases, signs, symptoms, optical disorders of rheumatism, which also includes osteoarthritis. There's a lot of ambiguity and gray area. We are in 2020, technology has changed. When we are talking about AI and 3D and robotics in healthcare, we can't talk of law which is so many years old. It is why I think there is a possible amendment. But I strongly emphasize on this platform that there is a need to relook at the schedule. I'm not against the provisions on curing, avoiding self-medications and those quacks and magic remedies being promoted. That is required. But all the diseases or symptoms or disorders mentioned in schedule is too vague, too wide, and too ambiguous. We need to work something on this schedule, and regulators must look into it as fast as possible when they are looking at amendment of DMRA. On UCPMP, there was a very pertinent question by one person that it is violated. It is must be violated. The provisions must not be followed because there is no law. So as Darren mentioned, there is a need for having a proper legislation which also brings pharmaceutical companies. Most of the companies are complying, but because of being voluntary, there are so many confusions and ambiguity leading to make us busy, which I don't like. I don't want to be busy for client work when things are not very clear in law because it is voluntary. So relook at DMRA from schedule point of view and looking at UCPMP to make it a very decent and uh, uh, clear law which helps company go full blast in promoting their products within the four walls of the law. And that is where I always say that head is where law comes and heart is where ethics come. Every company, every doctor needs to have a proper balance of head and heart of being ethical and being legal, and it is and it's going to be ultimately self-regulation and your conscience what is going to say what I should do, what I should not do. And that's why you very rightly said that normalcy is the essence of life. Excess of anything is dangerous. Thank you very much, everyone. If Nishith Bhai is there, he wants to say a minute or so, you are most welcome.